thank you all again for showing up, especially on a warm, rainy day. And thank you, tremendous thanks to Rabbi Blau for joining us. We were supposed to meet tonight, then the war with Iran started and there were no flights, and we switched it to Sunday on Zoom. And then we switched it back to tonight because Rabbi Blau was able to join us. And we are very honored to have him join us. I don't think I need to say much about Rabbi Blau, but most recently Rabbi Blau was the Mashgiach Ruchani, the spiritual dean at Yeshiva University for many decades. He also started an important nonprofit called Magen to help people who were sexually abused. He moved to Israel the week we had our conference. He made Aliya. And we are excited to hear. He's going to talk for about
20 minutes.
20 minutes, and which will be more of a general conversation about the topic. And then we will open it, and potentially if people want, we will be more current and talk more about current events. We've always started with a very short Dvar Torah, and I want to say just a short word before we start. This week's parasha is Parashat Chukat, which has all kinds of beautiful things about purity and impurity and red heifers. And I was struck by this pasuk in Perek Yud Tet, "V'chol asher yiga al pnei hasadeh b'chalal cherev o b'met או בעצם אדם, או בקבר, יטמע 7 ימים. And he who will touch on the land someone dead from a sword or dead body or bone of man or a kever, a grave, will be impure for 7 days. And the Ramban has a long conversation, and then he says, "V'rabotenu asu b'midrash mipnei yituro." So it says, "Al pnei hasadeh b'chalal cherev." Chalal is usually a word used only for someone killed in battle. So why do they have to say someone killed in battle by a sword? Chalal cherev, it seems redundant. And the Ramban says, "V'rabotenu asu b'midrash mipnei yituro." This redundancy got the rabbis to say a midrash, lomar shehacherev kechalal. The sword itself is like a dead body. Shelo ba katuv ela lashvot hachalal ve'acherev. Therefore, the sword itself and the dead body are similarly tme'im, similarly impure. לומר שהוא נעשה אבי אבות לטומאה כמת עצמו ומטמא אדם אוכלים טומאת שבעה. And he goes on to explain that the sword is a little bit different than a corpse. It doesn't make the house impure, but it makes anyone who touches it. I think we're at a time where we're encountering and hearing and experiencing a tremendous amount of death and a tremendous amount of military violence. And whether it is justified or not, and in different instances that might be different, this in itself, this type of death and this type of warfare is something that affects all of us and creates some kind of impurity on everyone who encounters it. And I think, my blessing is that we can move on from this type of environment in which we are all touched so deeply by death and move into a time of more peace. And with that, I will turn it on to Rabbi Blau.
When I agreed to speak, I obviously didn't anticipate the war with Iran, and I certainly didn't anticipate the events that have taken place in the last couple of days, where a significant number of Jewish terrorists have attacked Palestinian villages and then the Israeli army. And I'm not going to speak about them per se, but I will speak about the environment which has made it very difficult for larger groups to condemn them. They wouldn't necessarily do these things, but they will somehow give up with an explanation, such as the comment made by Minister Smotrich after the first night of violence, when an Israeli soldier whose car was being stoned shot in the air, and apparently one of the bullets hit a 14-year-old kid who was rioting. And the comment was, you know, it's a difference if an Arab throws a stone than if a Jew throws stones. Right? If a Palestinian throws stones, you got to shoot to kill them. And if a Jew throws stones, you don't shoot fellow Jews. I'm almost quoting him verbatim. So I want to understand the context in which that was said. Also want to point out that contrary to what we might think, the shift in thinking within significant elements in the religious Zionist community was not caused by the Hamas's brutal attack on October 7th, because the election prior to that, prior to the Hamas attack, was the election in which the Religious Zionist Party ran together with the Kahanist Otzma Yehudit Party and Noam, a very small party of Yeshiva Taramor, of the Chardal movement, and got 14 seats in the Israeli Knesset, a larger number than I think they've gotten in 50 years. And that was before. And the fact of the matter is that subsequent to the Gaza war, where under normal circumstances countries move to the right politically when there's a war, feelings of patriotism, the same Religious Zionist Party, now separated again, has not gotten enough votes in polls to even get into Knesset, which would mean enough to have 4 seats. So that's not it. It's something that took place much earlier. So I want to start with talking about an earlier massacre that people have forgotten about. In 1982, it was the first Israeli-Lebanon war. And Israel went in to uproot the PLO that was based in Lebanon, and they had come all the way up to Beirut, and then there was a terrible event. The phalangist Christian Arab Party, which was working together with the Israelis, their political leader, who had been appointed the president, was assassinated. We now know that he was assassinated by elements loyal to Syria, but it was not impossible at that time to say that it was done by Palestinian elements. And elements of this Christian Arab Lebanese army went into 2 Palestinian refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila, and they massacred, and there are different numbers given, from 1,000 to 3,000, we don't know for sure, men, women, and children. They raped women. They did everything terrible that Hamas did, except they didn't take hostages. Remember, it was one group of Arabs to another group of Arabs. However, the Israeli army was basically in control, and they literally shut down the camps so that no one was allowed to leave the camps. And the question came up, what did the leadership of the Israeli army, the Secretary of Defense at that time was Arik Sharon, what did they know? And since the massacres took place over 2 days, even if they didn't know originally, 2 days is a long time to find out that which you don't want to find out. So there was a dispute in Israel whether to set up a commission of inquiry. That sounds familiar. Okay. So Rabbi Soloveitchik from America, who did not speak up often about Israeli matters, his comment often was, Israel has its own rabbinate, it's not my place to say from Chutz La'aretz. In this case was very adamant, and he contacted the leaders of the then Religious Zionist Party, which was then called Mafdal, and said to them, if you don't, and they were part of the coalition, if you don't support the Commission of Inquiry, I'm going to remove myself from any connection to the movement, which was a very powerful threat. And they voted for it, and there was a commission, right, that found the level of responsibility. And the details I'm not going to go into now, but what was important that not only did he say so, but there was a dispute amongst rabbinic figures in Israel. So Rabbi Lichtenstein was one of those who spoke very strongly about the need for the commission. And in contrast to his father-in-law, he wrote a lengthy explanation of his position. And within it, he made a very interesting comment. He said in the story of Shaul, the first king of Israel, who in the Sefer Shmuel was told by the Navi Shmuel to kill out Amalek, and he left the king alive, right? And there were a whole back and forth between Shaul and Shmuel. And so Rabbaran said that once he left the king alive, meant he wasn't doing so to simply fulfill what the Torah required of him. Therefore, he is now responsible for the death of all the civilians of the Amalekite, and that he were not part of the army. If he wasn't fulfilling the mitzvah, then what right did he have to harm anybody, any civilians? And this caused the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Harav, Rav Yisraeli, at the time, to give a public denouncement of this. Right? How can you say that? You know, so you can get a full mitzvah, you get a partial mitzvah. So, now, Rabbaran's position was based on his well-known article of whether there's an ethic, according to Judaism, outside of halacha, in which he speaks about universal moral law that exists independent of the Torah itself. And of course, the classic proof is Abraham arguing with God about the justice of killing out the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? You're going to kill the righteous together with the guilty. How could God do something that's not just? So clearly there is an independent notion of what is just. And this is part of a much broader paper. He goes through in halachic terms, which I can't go over now, the concept of lifnim mishurat hadin, kofen al midat stone, darkei shalom, a series of principles that are utilized. They're in halacha, but they're not the same as normal things in halacha. No, there's a difference between din, which is very well defined, and lifnim mishurat hadin is going beyond the letter of the law, which is also strikingly a halachic requirement, at least according to the Ramban, but is not as well defined. It's a broader notion. And this notion that there is a independent moral code that exists automatically, right? Because Rav Saja Gaon talks about those mitzvot that if the Torah didn't give it to us, we would know anyway that you can't kill, you can't rob. Right? This notion is a very important background for the people who objected and demanded a commission of inquiry. That even though the Jews didn't do the killing, but if they knew about it and they could have prevented it, and they did not, so we'll use the technical term, they're accessories to the crime. And that's terrible in its own right. Now, what was the mentality of those who thought differently? And that's where I see the beginnings of that which has become much more extensive with time. And I use the phrase, when Esther asked me for a title, the objection to quote-unquote Western morality, which is seen as fundamentally Christian and not Jewish, right? So all these moral concerns that you have are not objective moralities because you're influenced by the Christian world, right? Forgive everybody, we're all guilty anyway, it's only the grace of God, etc. So where does this conflict, this disagreement come from? So if you go to the writings of Rav Kook, who is the most influential on the Israeli community, and remember, in 1982, you still have a political and rabbinic leadership in Israel trained in Europe, born in Europe and trained in Europe, and not a product of a very of an Israeli educational system. Right? And Rav Kook believed in universal morality. It's very clear that he believed in such. But at the same time, there were two other elements in Rav Kook. One was a very unusual interpretation of World War I. Remember, Rav Kook passed away before World War II. World War II was much clearer anti-fascism. Which country was better or more democratic in World War I was not as clear. Right? So he blamed World War I on Christianity. Right? Christianity is at fault. So he was very anti-Christian, one thing. And number two, of course, Rav Kook was very mystical, messianic, seeing this as the unfolding of the messianic time and seeing Israel. And he accepted a notion which existed amongst some Jewish thinkers for generations, hundreds of years, the notion of Jewish superiority. Most associated, and of course the sefer that everybody teaches in Israel, in the religious Zionist world, is the Kuzari. The author of the Kuzari says very explicitly that in the order of creation, right, everybody knows there's 4 levels, and the highest level is man, so he has 5 levels, and the highest level is Israel. And the Jew is a higher level creature than the rest of humanity. In fact, famously, he asked this question to the Ibn Ezra, and they come up with this theory of the sin of the golden calf, that it was not idolatry. Because it's inconceivable that the Jews who had just gotten the Torah on Har Sinai 40 days before could have been guilty of idolatry. Not the Jews that we know. And they come up with an alternate explanation that the golden calf was somehow going to replace Moshe, but not to replace God. Right? Jews are higher level. Right? Okay, so you have the notion that Christianity is very problematic, and that Jews are a higher level creature than everyone else. Now, it is true that Rav Kook himself saw this superiority on behalf of creating a better world for everybody. He was partially a nationalist and partly a universalist. I suggest if anybody is really interested, the easiest book to read is one of Professor Mirsky's book on Rav Kook. More of his son, Rav Yehuda, sort of took out all the humanistic parts and focused on the national one. Remember, Rav Kook, after in the later years, was much too busy to write books. So the books that came out, mainly after he passed away, were based on his notebooks. And his notebooks was his thoughts that he wrote down every night, which if you read them, it obviously doesn't read like a book, it's all over the map. And his son and his student, the Nazir of David Cohen, took selections and turned them into different books, and I'm not going to get caught up in the details about that. All right, but you have these notions of Jewish superiority and something against the Christians, even though it comes with still a universalism. This gets translated into the notion that what you think is universal morality is this Western notion you got from the Christians, and it's not Jewish. And you could even go back earlier to a non-Orthodox source, to Achad Ha'am, talking about Rachmim V'Din, where he differentiates between Judaism and Christianity. But the notion of din in Judaism is not meant to be without any notion of Rachmim at all. This is a long debate. Shai Held just wrote a book about mercy in Judaism this past year about it. And we know that you have Jewish sources in both directions. Now, in America, the one person who pursued this notion of Jews are superior, this other notion is Christian, and democracy is not a Jewish notion, was Meir Kahane. If anybody bothered reading his writings. But when he came to Israel, he didn't have great influence, but he had enough of an influence to produce Baruch Goldstein, though, who was an American, and to basically produce Itamar Ben-Gvir, who follows his mentality. But you already get this notion that we're not bound by Western morality. We have a different notion of morality. Our morality is based on the Torah, and whatever the Torah tells us is moral by definition. Right. Now, it's interesting that the Ramban, of all people, who is the one they always quote about Eretz Israel, is the one who is in many ways the clearest in the notion that Judaism is not only din, not only halacha. There are three famous Rambans, where the Ramban, the one in Kedoshim Tihiyu, when he talks about morality, and he says the technical legality is not everything. You can be a naval b'shut HaTorah. You have to have a moral sense of what's appropriate even if it's technically permissible. He applies it even in a ritual sense in terms of the Shabbat and the Yom Tovim. There's an atmosphere of Shabbat that goes beyond the formalities, and he applies it in human interactions in the pasuk V'asita hayashar v'hatov, which he says it l'fnim mishurat hadin and pshara. L'fnim mishurat hadin is to go beyond the requirements of the law, and pshara is a legal notion, which and this gives you an idea of the back and forth, that there's a whole sugya in the Gemara whether pshara is an accommodation, a mediation, rather than strict law coming out on one side or the other in a monetary dispute. And there are views that say pshara is preferable, and there are views that say pshara is terrible, right? It's not the law. And the conclusion of the Gemara is you should prefer pshara unless you know the answer, right? Once you've come to a conclusion what the law is, then it's too late to compromise. You know what the law is, but initially, and that's how, by the way, Batei Din that deal with monetary disputes, they will always work towards pshara, to sometimes accommodation. It doesn't mean you split the baby 50-50, but it means you take into consideration that there's some truth on every side of the argument. Right? So you have within Judaism a very strong legal system that can be technical, and you also have certain moral notions that go beyond the technical. The exact role of these moral notions and when they apply, it would take me way too long in the time that I have left. But they exist, and they're part of the process. And somehow, in the context of the Israeli society, with the religious community picking up an earlier Zionist notion of Shlilat HaGolah, right, which is said in other halakhic contexts. There's talk, Rav Kook talks about bringing back prophecy to determine halakha, not legal analysis, but prophecy. You should recite halakhic questions according to the Yerushalmi and not the Bavli, because that's the authentic Torah is Torah Eretz Yisrael. You heard that phrase thrown around. It's often hard to define. I don't think the people who even use it know how to define it, but they have in mind that the Torah that came out of the Galut is not 100% the authentic one, right? And the mentality that's associated with the Galut is not the authentic one. So you have developed in Israel this notion that Western morality is not the morality we care about, one. Two, I look in the Makorot, they don't talk about democracy, so we don't really need democracy. I listened to a podcast when someone, he happened to be an American originally, went to YU, was speaking on behalf of Chevron, who said that the Arabs in Israel will give them, they can vote for 3 seats out of 120. Right? That's the maximum they can get. We don't have to have democracy. Who said we have to have democracy? And there are works that have been written reflecting this changed mentality. There's a great deal of difference of that was written at the beginning of the state by Reb Herzog, who wanted a religious state, but was very busy making a religious state that would fit into the modern democratic world, which with those who want a religious state that doesn't fit in the modern democratic world, who needs the modern democratic world. And this mentality has become very much accepted. I'm going to just throw in one other element, and that is, because we're living through wars, the Hilchot Milchamot, the Jewish law about wars, is very sparse. If one sees the Rambam has a couple of chapters in Hilchot Melachim, and their wars. It's very little. Very little. The Shulchan Aruch, of course, has nothing. There's nothing. And so when you have very little in sources, there are different ways to try to deal with it. One way is, if you're going back to when we were in Eretz Israel, is to use Tanakh for halacha, right? And suddenly, wars, as they were fought 3,000 years ago, become the definition of how we deal with wars today, right? With no acknowledgement of all the changes and the various international laws about wars and the agreements. You know, it's Tanakh, right? Which, by the way, you really don't find, you know, people paskening halachic shalos by quoting psukim in Tanakh. That's not how it works. In fact, the Gemara says you can't learn halacha from Nach, only from the Torah itself. But here you don't have other sources, and if you don't see the modern world as relevant, so you look at how wars were fought 3,000 years ago, we'll prove it from Yoshua, right? We'll prove it from Shimshon HaGibor, right? And that mentality has become part of the educational system in the religious Zionist community, and it therefore was responsible for this, in many ways, for this extraordinary shift from a party that was comfortable in a left-wing government, which had a significant element of a Pola Mizrahi, of religious kibbutzim. I could say the word socialist, but I should say the word communist. The religious kibbutzim were communist in a way that Russia wasn't, right? Was communism was meant to be, right? And many of its leaders were very leftist in dealing with the Arab population as well, to the party that is the extreme right of today. I hope that my giving some kind of background will clarify some of the shift that's taken place. I'm sure there are other people who will come up with alternate explanations. This is the best I can do, having been trying to work on this for a number of years. And I'm open to any question or comment that you have.
So the only thing we need to do is to repeat the questions when people ask them, so the people on Zoom can hear as well.
Yeah.
I can.
No, I've learned.
Repeat them.
I've learned,
Nissan.
having done this stuff, is that you're supposed to repeat the question.
Exactly.
Because otherwise people hear answers to nothing, and they don't seem to make sense because there's no context. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I am proud to be an alumnus of the same Yeshiva Katana, the same elementary school as Rav Blau. The best yeshiva in the world, Yeshiva Torah Emet, Torah Emes. My question, getting back to the verses that the Rav taught us in the interaction between Shaul and Shmuel. Is there an idea that there would be some kind of protective moral envelope if one is truly executing the Ratzon Hashem and many innocent civilians die inadvertently?
Okay, that's an the question was, if Shaul actually killed everyone, so did he have a moral protection? He's following the Ratzon Hashem. All the Orthodox Jewish thinkers that I know, including someone like the late Rabbi Wurzberger, who was very concerned about ethical elements in Judaism, if God said something, God commanded something, we can't argue in the end. At the end of the day, we accept what God requires, even if we have a great deal of moral difficulty with it. But we take it only exactly what God told us to do. Right? We don't extend it. I didn't have time to go into, the unfortunate comment which is in the Rav's Kol Dodi Do Fake about Amalek existing in our time, which when people used it, I don't like quoting the Rav unless it's public statements, even because I had the opportunity of hearing them private ones, but very clearly he was very uncomfortable when people said, oh, this one's Amalek and that one's Amalek, and we're allowed to act accordingly. I didn't go in at all into how, even if you assume Hamas is Amalek, like the Nazi Germany, and by the way, there are differences. The Nazi complaint about Jews was just Jews are inferior beings, and Hamas is extremist, but they're arguing to some degree that we have a right to have the land and not the Jews, which is a different kind of an argument, no matter how extreme they are. But the extension from Hamas to everybody in Gaza, and the extension from everybody in Gaza to every Palestinian, that I can say with certainty the Rebbe would have been shocked that anybody would do that. And we find that I just today saw a retired religious Zionist general say the solution is to eliminate every single Palestinian from Gaza, all 2 million of them, of course voluntarily. But this extension, is such. I didn't cover all aspects of it. Because I didn't want to take forever. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I've noticed over the years that as much as the religious Zionists in Israel have really lost their way, a lot of them, it's almost as if the modern Orthodoxy or the modern Orthodox establishment here in the U.S. are almost like overcompensating in their zeal for just supporting Israel without any kind of condition, or it's almost as if you speak to an Israeli and they know that things are complicated, and they know that Netanyahu was sending money to Hamas, and there was all of this kind of conspiracy stuff going on. But if you speak to like a normal, modern Orthodox kid at YU today, they have no idea. Like they're uninformed, and it becomes something like even, I guess, harsher and more idealistically, how would I put it? The disposition is much more idealistic or ideological, and much less something that's realistic. Do you see a future for modern Orthodoxy in this country?
Okay.
You have to repeat the question.
I'm going to repeat the question.
No, I'm saying it's even worse than what I've seen.
Yeah. It's the reserving of a totally separate talk. But the question is that the apparent response of the modern Orthodox community in America is we support Israel, period. Right? And therefore, no nuance, no details. We don't know or care about Netanyahu's personal needs. We don't have any. We don't want to know what's happening in Gaza. We're supporting Israel, period. And that, I said, deserves a whole talk. Was a good part of it is reflective of the education. Again, I've been an educator all these years, so I see things in terms of education. The large number of American modern Orthodox young people who study in Israel for a year or two get a very narrow, one-sided perspective of Israel. They don't really interact with Israelis, but they get told Israel is good, rah, rah, rah. And that's what they come back with. And they do not have a nuanced position. They're not very knowledgeable about details. When I was in yeshiva, I would tell people, the day before there's an Israeli election, I'm going to go in the Beit Midrash and find out how many people can name 2 candidates for anything in Israel. By now they know Netanyahu's name, right? He's been prime minister all these years. How many other names do they know? They know the names of the parties running, let alone what they stand for. And the answer is that most of them don't have the foggiest notion, right? It's a very simplistic thing. We support Israel. And when Israel's being attacked, and some of the people attacking Israel extended to attack all Jews, because all Jews are associated with Israel. So then, of course, you're going to get a very defensive reaction. But it is overly simplistic, and it is caused, by the way, negative reactions when people go to college and they think they know all the answers, and they can't respond because they have such simplistic notions. So it's a real issue. But I don't think it's all the modern Orthodox Jews. I think it's much of the modern Orthodox Jewish leadership. That is true. But in the leadership, there's a wholly different issue here. And I spent a number of years being very active when I was president of Religious Zionism in America, so I was at World Zionist Congresses and conference of the presidents of major American Jewish organizations. So I interacted in those circles. And there was a tremendous age gap. You could see the people in their own sons and daughters that they were not communicating. People of a certain age, and I guess I'm above every certain age, we remember not just the victory in 67, we remember the before 67. Right? We remember Israel is very vulnerable. And we have a certain image of Israel based on that. People who were born 30 years later just see Israel as the biggest military power in the Middle East, was just reinforced in terms of Iran, and don't see this vulnerable Israel. And there's a real gap. There is a gap in the Jewish community. I don't have the statistics, and I was in Israel during the primaries in New York. It would be interesting to know what percentages of the Jews voted and for whom they voted, and whether there was an age differentiation. Right? Whether it was, how much were the differences in people voted for Cuomo and voted for Manzi, of different age brackets. I don't know the answer. What?
We have the final numbers.
We don't have the breakdown.
Okay. I don't know the statistics, but I think, but it's clear in other areas that the difference in generations plays a major role, less in the modern Orthodox community than other communities, but certainly in the Jewish community in general. Yes?
I think we need to pick a woman.
Please.
Rabbi, this is slightly different, but you brought it up, slightly different than where we're going. When you were,
One never knows where questions are going to go.
okay. I believe it's, and if I'm wrong, please tell me so, and if I'm right, could you explain it, that there's a Kabbalistic notion that the Jewish soul is greater than a non-Jewish soul. Now, what happens later in life,
Okay.
A Jew is born with a harder soul than a non-Jew, which makes him better than the non-Jew.
Okay. The question was the Kabbalistic notion that the Jew has a different kind of soul than a non-Jew.
Yeah, higher level.
Higher level. Right. So it's very interesting. Kabbalah is very in now. Right. It certainly wasn't in my education. And I'm not very sympathetic to it, to be honest with you. If you want to trace some of this, again, we can go back to, I quoted the Kuzari, the difference between the Kuzari and the Rambam, right? Now, it's very interesting, when I was teaching a class in Rambam, my son in Israel suggests, and the Kuzari, I was contrasting the two, gave me two books to read. One which was very strong in how different their mentalities were, and how the Rambam sees Jews as same as everybody else. The only thing that makes us better is that we follow the Torah that was given to us, that trains us, and we have learned to be by being descendants of Avraham Avinu, who modeled all these things. I can quote this directly from the Rambam, where the Rambam, in a remarkable portion, when he talks about treating non-Jewish slaves, first says the law, that you're allowed to do X, Y, and Z, and then ends with saying, but a Jew won't do that. You know, we're descendants of Abraham. We're given the Torah. We care about everybody. We certainly wouldn't take advantage of the fact that Jewish law lets us do it, right? But not because we're intrinsically so, but because we're trained through the Torah. While the Kuzari says we're intrinsically different, without being a Kabbalist, right? And the other book, written by an Israeli, the first one's written by an American professor who lives in Israel. The second one's written by an Israeli, plays down the differences, right? And says, no, the Rambam's closer to the Kuzari, right? Right. This Kabbalistic notion is there. It's there in different forms in the Maharal. It's there in the Tanya. And it's there in Rav Kook, right? Definitely, except it makes the Jews more responsible, right? It's not there in the non-Kabbalistic worlds. For example, the Or Someach, classic literature Rav, rabbi in Dvinsk, which was Latvia, but Latvia is in Jewish life is still Lithuania. Jews have a different notion of countries than everybody else had in Europe. No, my family comes from Galicia, a country that never existed. But Jewishly it existed. Right? In the Meshech Chochmah, the Or Sameach says the reason that if you kill a non-Jew, it's Misa B'dei Shemayim, and he's not killed in court as it is if a Jew kills another Jew, is because killing a non-Jew is worse, because it's the Chilul Hashem. So it's even worse. That's why our punishment's not enough against it. But that's a very non-Kabbalistic perspective. It's there in Kabbalistic sources. I can't undo that. It's a question of how you use it. I like to quote something from the Kuzari because it's sort of astonishing, the Kuzari. In the early part of the work of the Kuzari, the king of the Khazars, who has this ongoing dream that he intends to do the right thing, but somehow he doesn't carry it out, to look for something. So he goes to a philosopher, and then he goes to a Christian, and then to a Muslim, and ultimately he comes to the Jew, right, the last one. So when he comes to the Jew, the Chacham says to him, well, let's look at the Christians and the Muslims. You know, what do they say they believe in, and how do they carry it out? The Christians talk about a God of love, and what happens when the Christians take over a country, right? I think it was before the Crusades, but the Crusades is a very good demonstration. The Muslims talk about, you know, one God and everything, and what happens to the Muslims? Anybody doesn't become a Muslim, they kill out, right? So they're all hypocrites. So the king of the Khazars turns to the Chacham and says, okay, but you Jews you're not in charge of any country. So how do we know that you're going to be any different? Right? There's no test case. And if you look in the book, there's no answer. Right? Obviously, it can't be an answer. It's a hypothetical question. But it's no longer a hypothetical question. Right? And the assumption of the work is Jews are a higher level, therefore they're going to treat people better. Now that we're higher level, therefore we're going to treat people worse. Right? It's clear that's the assumption of the work. So you can see Jewish superiority as making demands upon us, or as we're better than you, so you don't count. And that's some of the things I was trying to respond to.
Rabbi Blau, I think we're going to take now one from the Zoom.
Oh, please, yes.
And then we'll pick another person
Yeah,
here. So I'll repeat the question.
I would be fair to people online. Yeah.
So, yes, we have a few questions. So one, the talk was fascinating. I'd be curious to hear the Rav speak about whether he has thoughts about how we go about reaching out to our brothers and sisters and encourage growth in this ethical vision. I totally agree about the centrality of education. Is there more we can do?
Do you want to give a few and then?
That's
Rabbi.
one. A related question.
So the first question was about education and how we can move our community.
And
Or we can answer that one.
two questions. You've called out the moral hypocrisy within religious Zionism. Has there been any meaningful response or just deflection and denial? And what would you advise those in America who agree with your critique of religious Zionism and want to act on it? So, related.
Okay. I was asked what can be done if, assuming my critique I think is correct. Obviously, I think it's correct. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made it. To educate others, to impact upon others. So let me start out by the observation I made at the very beginning of my talk. It's really astonishing in Israel that the response to the horrors of Hamas has been a reduction of support for the religious Zionist position. Right? Now, I realize polls is not an election, right? But there have been hundreds of polls over 2 years, and they never get any more votes, right? It's consistent, and it's not at all clear that all those who support Ben Gvir are coming from the religious Zionist community either. I think there's already a certain shift taking place. I won't say it's gone very far. It's gone far enough. But I believe in Israel there's a beginning of a shift, right? And I may be a bit naive to think at 86 I'm going to change Israel very much, but Don Quixote's always been my hero, so it's a question of getting the dialogue going. It's, I think, what has happened in New York, which is very complicated, and I have no idea who's going to would make a good mayor of New York. It seems to be an impossible job. But the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel is a very important question. And there's no doubt that many people who are anti-Israel are anti-Semitic, but they're anti-Semites who are pro-Israel. And, it's not the same. And if we can get that dialogue started to realize that it's not all simplistic. We don't really live in a world of great intellectual concerns. That's another whole topic of my experience as an educator. When I was a kid, we were looking we really were concerned about theological problems, and now the kids are concerned about finding meaning in their life. They're just in a different place. Now, obviously, I'm exaggerating in the sense that there are always exceptions to every rule of it. I think it's a question of getting the dialogue going. And yeah, I'd be happier to speak that I will have an opportunity to speak in an audience which is less sympathetic with my position. It's always easier to speak in audiences that people agree with you. That makes life, much easier. But the impact upon it, of course, is minimal. The people agree with you already, so what are you accomplishing?
Wait till we put this on YouTube. Wait till we put this on YouTube. Don't worry.
No. I was very pleasantly surprised by the responses that I got to the talk on YouTube. And I got it from, aside from my grandson in Israel in Yeshiva University, who had to tell me how all his left-wing friends were so happy that his grandfather said those things. I got very few criticisms. And I've gotten much more criticisms for articles I've written, or op-eds that I've put in for taking stands. I got a lot of support and comments, very few critical ones. So I think it's hitting a nerve. It's just hard at this time. Another war with Iran. There's no reason to be sympathetic with the Iranian government in any way. No reason to be sympathetic with Hamas. How to separate? We'll see. I mean, if Israeli foreign policy is going to be determined by Trump, then it doesn't make any difference anyway. But I can't imagine that he won't move on to something else pretty soon. It's changing a mentality, and it's important to do it in America as well as in Israel. The students I deal with in YU are very, very much pro-Israel, and yet I don't think I was pleasantly surprised by the number of them who came over to me to declare that I was speaking about it. Now, I don't want to fall in the trap if you spoke to 5 of your friends and 4 of them are on your side, then you get 80% of the population. Those kind of fake statistics obviously aren't worth very much. But I was surprised by some of the students who came over because they don't talk about it, and they are, serious students in yeshiva, mainstream in every way. Not you always expect that there's a majority opinion, that there's some students who go out of the way to be the minority. But these were not that kind of students at all. So I think it's more people than we imagine. I think it has to be not just, caught up in this left-right thing, which is you decide every question by label. If I label you, decide that I'm not on, so then I don't have to deal with the ideas that you say, because you're, all we can do is try to speak to people, and hopefully that it gets through. I think the recent events, how far gone, the called the Hilltop Youth, or whoever it is doing these things, and how turned off most Israelis are by it, because it's. I mean, I was just listening as I left the house to a commentator who writes for the Time of Israel, who's very well popular, and he's very not leftist at all. And he said, well, they're obviously Jewish terrorists. Their purpose is to terrorize. right? To terrorize the Palestinians, they'd run away, but it can be more than that. And there will be an election coming up at some times in Israel, and there is some internal thinking, right? I'm not, I don't want to get in political candidacies, and certainly the bulk of the community is right-wing, but I think there's quite a difference between Bennett and Smotrich, for example. If I can use names that hopefully someone knows, at least those names. Yes?
I think we're going to take one last question.
One last
Maybe
question.
you, Sarah. And then, and then we'll wrap up.
First of all, thank you so much for your moral leadership in this area. It's been personally so meaningful. This is continuing on the education question. I'm a mother of 3 young children who are in wonderful Bergen County day schools, but with a very simplistic idea of Israel, and also to further complicate it in my children's situation, some of their favorite uncles and aunts live out in the Shtatim, and they've been there, they know the places, but how as a mother can I cultivate in this nuanced conversation, nuanced view of Israel in my children, and I guess so we're in a better place in 10, 20
Okay.
years.
The question was, as a mother, what my children are hearing in school, and they have uncles and aunts living in the Shtachim. By the way, my son in Israel, who's certainly not a rightist, lives in Alon Shvut, which is in the Shtachim. You say it's different, but I think we should point out that, when we talk about the Shtachim and the settlers, we're talking about a lot of different people. A good number of them are Haredim who moved there because they provided cheap housing for them. Cities like Beitar, Eilit, they're anti-Zionist and whatnot. But they're very big. They're very big, and it's cheap to live there, and they don't have that much money, so they live there. So it's a complicated question. But I want to deal with the moral issue, not the whole political one, which is so complicated. Parents shouldn't be giving everything over to schools. Right? When we brought up our children, they went to schools that didn't always share our personal ideological feelings, and we were very clear to them that you should gain from what the school has to offer, and it doesn't mean you have to accept their ideology. When our oldest son was in a very yeshivish place, and then he left to go to YU to learn with the Rav and to go to YU. So other parents said, how did you do this? Our son won't do that. I said, because you're starting now, right? It had to be all the time. Parents have their own obligation to educate their children. The schools are just our agents, right? The Torah's mitzvah is Limanat B'neichem is not, that, even though the Gemara says we should thank Yeshua ben Gamma because he started schools, because not every parent can teach the child, and there's all kinds of circumstances. But ideally, the parent is transmitting the values to the children, right? That's the Pesach Seder. Parents should feel free to present their own ideas. I realize the schools are very simplistic. A granddaughter of ours is in a school, in a modern Orthodox school, and they, right after the attack on October 7th, they have the person who does Israel in the school, and he gave this rah-rah speech, and only one student asked a question about what happens to the civilians in Gaza, and then he went to our son, who's teaching the school, said, I knew right away you brought up your daughter well. Parents, you can't always change the system in the schools. You pick a school where you think it's best for your children, but you don't give up being parents. I never understood why parents give up completely any influence in education. Now, when I was a kid, it was quite different, right? I'm old enough to be part of the first generation that had serious yeshiva education in America. So the contrast between our parents, many of whom were first generation. My parents were second, but most people around us were first generations. But they were not a product of the same kind of yeshiva education I had, because no one was a product of that education. So at that time, the parents could not compete with the schools in anything Jewish, because the schools, the Rebbeim knew, and the parents weren't educated. And by the time the kids had finished elementary school, they had more knowledge than their parents. So I understand that they would listen to their teachers and not to the parents. The teachers know, the parents don't know. But this is, 2-3 generations later. The parents had yeshiva education also for a lot of years. I'm not saying that they know as much as the teachers in the school, but they know an awful lot. And they're allowed to say what I learned and what I think and what I know, and not be embarrassed by it. And I hope that children are smart enough to, fit the pieces together. We don't want them to be simplistic, so they have to know that you can hear different opinions. That's that's the first step in not being simplistic, to know that there's more than one way of looking at things.
Yes, and.
I want all of us to join together to thank Rabbi Blau for your moral clarity and for your support. And I think this message that we all have the power in our hands to educate not only our children, but our friends and our parents and our rabbis and our fellow congregants and the principals of our schools. I think all of us have a role to play here, whether it's asking a question or reminding them that there's another way to look at the same issue. So thank you again. I also forgot to thank initially Sally Gottesman and Rachel Tiven, and especially Ezra Tiven Gottesman for setting up all the chairs. And thank you, everyone. We can mingle a bit, and then I guess if we can make a corner for those who want to do Mariv, that would be wonderful. And thank you to all the people on Zoom. We are very excited that we hopefully managed to do this. Thank you all.